Hello everyone, I'm Charlene Cranny and I'm the Director of Communications and Campaigns at UCSIF, and I'm also the Director of Good Money Week. In case you don't know, Good Money Week exists to help people find sustainable and ethical options for banking, pensions, savings and investments. And this year it's supported by Aberdeen Standard Investments, Lion Trust, Aviva and Stewart Investors. So thank you so much for your support. Each year there is a different theme or focus, and this year it is about showing consumers and investors how they can use their money to support a green and fair UK recovery from the pandemic. We really want to create some optimism and empower people to take part in, take ownership of, and financially benefit from the project to build back better. So we'll look today at the results of our YouGov poll of 1,600 Brits, sharing their experiences of and attitudes to money and ethics during the pandemic. Then FinText analysis of online investor conversations. We asked if they were using the same language as the professionals when it comes to sustainable investing and what they really feel about it. Not featured in our industry-facing report, but our consumer-facing guide, Eiris Foundation will share a research Good Money Week commission to look at which investment and finance products and providers could best help support a UK green and fair recovery. So what are the things that the industry can do to support a better recovery, and who is doing it so far, so retail investors and others really know where they can look. Finally, our fund manager speakers will share how they are attempting to improve the availability and take up of sustainable investment in retail, and how they are having a real world impact on things like a green and fair recovery. But before all that, most of you will be aware that UCSIF has a new CEO. So James Alexander is here to meet you and say a few words of introduction.
Great, thank you very much, Charlene. It's great to be here, and the first event that I've been to speaking at with UCSIF, and delighted that there's so many people who have joined today's event and that we're going to have such a great conversation later today. Also want to add my thanks to our partners for this great Good Money Week, Aberdeen Standard Investors, Lion Trust, Aviva and Stewart Investors. As you are aware, as Charlene just said, UCSIF is the coordinating partner of Good Money Week. And I'm delighted to be coming on board as the new chief executive, and looking at how we can enhance the work that we do with our members, looking at how we can support you, our members, as effectively as possible at this absolutely critical time for sustainable finance and investment. We've seen public attitudes changing pretty dramatically, and some of the research that you're going to see in Good Money Week will show you about that. We've seen new commitments by governments and policymakers to net zero. We've seen diversity and social issues coming up the agenda like never before, and so we're really excited to be here, to be representing you, the voice of the sustainable investment and finance community across the UK. We're proud to represent you, we're proud to support you, and we look forward to continuing to build on our record of influencing the policy that makes sustainable investment and finance more effective and better in the UK. At events like today, informing the sector and creating challenging information gaps that exist, and of course connecting the sector together, which is obviously very hard to do in these COVID times, but we do look for ways to be better connecting the sector, having more roundtables, having more engagement, and you know, we come to the organisation with a bold vision for sustainable finance for in the future of the UK. We see it being the UK being an absolute leader, and we see UCSIF playing a very strong role in creating that leadership position. Next year is the organisation's 30th anniversary. And we look forward to celebrating that anniversary by creating a bold vision, a positive policy vision for how the UK can become a leader in sustainable finance. So if you want to be part of this and you're not currently a member, please do sign up. We've got some really exciting things happening over the next months and years. If you are a member, brilliant. We're so happy to have you on board, and we look forward to working with you and to representing you effectively, and to building together the sustainable finance space in the UK. So thank you very much for having me today. Thank you, Charlene, and look forward to this webinar. Thanks.
Thank you so much, James. It's really great to have you on board. So I'm going to move straight into the YouGov results by picking out some of the highlights and the main thrust of them. You can see more in the report, which is available on the UCSIF website. So nearly 40% of Brits say they weren't financially prepared for a pandemic, which is no surprise. But as you know, it's good to be financially prepared for tough times like losing a job or getting sick. But on the upside, over half actually saved money, with 30% taking their finances more seriously and nearly 40% of Brits wanting a financial revamp. However, while 30% are more keen to buy ethical and sustainable products than usual since the pandemic, only 5% would consider investing in a positive impact platform, while 50% would rather a bog standard savings account. So it seems to me that there's a lack of knowledge or of trust in sustainable finance products for the average person. Despite that, we have a country of environmentalists. David Attenborough and Greta Thunberg came top of public figures that exemplify the values and ethics we want to see more of in a better Britain. Marcus Rashford came third, and only 23% chose Boris Johnson. 51% of us want the government to lower emissions as part of building back better, even if it takes a bit longer, while 18% want the same, but as long as it doesn't take too long. 49% of Brits want green Build Back Better bonds that they can access, and this shoots up past 70% for those on higher incomes. Now I'm going to move on to the actual investor conversations. We commissioned FinText to analyse investor communities on the Reddit platform, which has a global investor community of over 1 million members as of July this year, and 17,000 in the UK specific investor community. Over 100 conversations are started a day on average. And what is really interesting is that the daily rate of new investor conversations seems to correlate with the S&P 500 volatility index. So investors talk when things are looking uncertain, and you'll see a graph visualizing that in the report. But what we wanted to discover is whether private investors were speaking the same language as us in sustainable finance and find out what they were saying. Unfortunately, it was a bit disappointing. Over 20 months, only a total of 74 conversations featuring a term like ESG, SRI, or ethical investing was started, with a total of just over 2,300 individual responses. So while ESG and sustainable finance is mainstreaming at the institutional level, it isn't quite trickling down just yet. But what else do we find? ESG is the most popular term, then it's ethical, then SRI. ESG and ethical were used together 46% of the time, which indicates a potential conflation of the two strategies. And the majority of conversations featured objections to this type of investment. The first objection was underperformance. This was raised in 43% of cases. Qualifying criteria was next. So my ESG is not your ESG, and this was raised 34% of the time. And the third was lack of impacts. And this is the complaint that equity ESG investing has no real world impact since it doesn't influence a company's behavior. So while this might feel like bad news, it's important to know what some groups of investors are thinking and where they need help to really understand all the different options, strategies, and benefits available to them. It really helps us to fill the gaps and get better at what we're doing. And if you want some tips on how to appeal to and attract sustainable investors, we have reviewed 10 academic choice experiments, which tested strategies on over 200,000 individuals to come up with 7 simple ways to improve communications. And these are all in the report. We don't have time today to go through them, I'm afraid. But let's now move on to Mandy at the Eiris Foundation to hear what she found in terms of all the options available to the retail market wishing to invest and save in a better Britain.
Thanks, Charlene. My name is Mandy Reynolds, and I am a project manager with the Eiris Foundation. Let me just share my screen here. Okay. So the Eiris Foundation is a UK-based foundation that is focused on promotion of socially responsible investment. We have been around since 1983, connected to the Eiris, which was a socially responsible research provider. We merged with Vigio Eiris in 2015, and now Vigio Eiris is VE within Moody's. One of our streams of research is to see how individuals can transform finance and push for socially responsible investment at a grassroots level. The Eiris Foundation has also been the provider of research for the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark since 2017, and we are responsible for Eiris Conflict Risk Network, which provides research on conflict areas in Sudan, South Sudan, and Yemen. So the Foundation's goals are really to mix tools and advocacy to achieve our aims. So just a brief introduction of the Green and Fair Recovery Data Project. This project, and thanks so much to UXIF for having us today, as well as to work with us over the past couple of months to put this project together. We really wanted to focus on 3 organizational types that were important for individuals. So we looked at banks with current accounts in the UK, pension funds, and we selected these pension funds based on size, local government pension schemes, and the top master trusts based on number of members. And for fund managers, we relied heavily in the selection process on Fund Eco Market, which is produced by SRI Services, to select sustainable, responsible, and ethical investment funds and their fund management firms. And all of this was focused on which financial service providers were more relevant to individuals, and what do individuals really want to know about the people who manage their money. So just a bit of background, in 2010, the Eiris Foundation released a guide for individuals called Your Ethical Money, designed to help consumers of financial products, so you and me, sort through the massive amounts of data to find the financial provider that aligned best with their values. So a decade later, we find ourselves focusing on the same questions. How can individuals make better informed decisions on who manage their money? So given this current socioeconomic, political, and cultural upheavals taking place across the world, we thought it was important to couch these questions in the context of a greener and fairer recovery. So individuals have a right to know what organizations are doing and how they're commenting, reporting, and advocating on the current issues that are relevant now. Issues like COVID-19 recovery and where to better communicate, and Black Lives Matter. And we found that, UXIF's Good Money Week, which was geared towards individuals and investment advisors, was a great place to present this research. So on to the research process. We developed this criteria with a mind towards current and long-term focuses that might shift the market to a greener and fairer recovery. So the particular topics that we were researching included COVID response with a focus on employees, Black Lives Matter movement with public statements and actions, as well as internal diversity reporting, climate change, the Sustainable Development Goals, investing in a better future, which included shifting money towards small and medium-sized enterprises, low carbon solutions, and then collaborative commitments and initiatives. And we thought this one was really important, and we chose to focus on it because it's important that we see organizations working together towards a common goal. We don't want to see a million ways of companies doing the same thing, but talking about it in vastly different terms. We would rather see collective action on the same problem. So people putting sort of a shoulder to the wheel rather than reinventing it. And so throughout this research process, we firstly gathered a team of experienced researchers in ESG, so environmental, social, and governance research. Then we did our first company outreach, which included focused questionnaires on a range of topics that we knew were going to be difficult on our end to research. So this was COVID response, net zero commitment. And then once we got that initial response back from companies, we incorporated these into the broader company research that we were doing on our end throughout the whole project. These This company research was compiled into company profiles from publicly available data. This data came almost entirely from the company and the company's website. And then we embarked on another company outreach with a fully completed company profile, which included, you know, our research and the company's initial response, and sent that off to the companies, and then incorporated those replies. And then we published the first round of data. So really, this isn't a full publishing of the company profiles, but we have provided it to UCSIF in order to draw conclusions and sort of think about it more fully. So just to put this in the context of the individual, if a single researcher was to do this project, it would have taken approximately 3 months' time of them working nearly full time. So it was, you know, a big lift, and it just shows you how sort of difficult it is to find and compile this type of information. So focusing on the organizations, we looked at 111 total organizations, and overall we had a 48.6% response rate. So for pension funds, the rate was 23.4% of pension funds or master trusts responded. For banks, it was about 35.3% of banks responded to us, and fund managers, by far and away, the best responders, they responded 80.4% to our questionnaires. So on to project findings, and I wanted to start out with this and then go a little bit into the individual organizational responses and then go back to overall findings. So while we've seen the ESG focused market grow by 30% in the last year, and PwC says that ESG funds could eclipse traditional funds in Europe by 2025. Why does it remain so difficult to find this information? And we came up with a few conclusions just over the course of this research. Firstly, that there's not a standardized reporting method, except where it's regulated. So, you know, companies are reporting vastly different types of information or focusing on a particular statistic, you know, that looks good for them. You know, a lot of this information that is reported by companies is jargon laden. And as Charlene mentioned, you know, we might not be using the same types of language. So this requires a lot of information and background research for individuals to be able to sort through this type of information. It's difficult for an individual to jump right in. Our research also focused on leading edge issues, which may not yet be addressed by these organizations, but probably should be, particularly Sustainable Development Goals and Black Lives Matter. And then we also found more technically that country-specific or type of investor-specific firewalls on particularly the fund managers, but sometimes banks and pension funds, made it really difficult to find the information that we were looking for. You had to sort of go down a rabbit hole in order to find, you know, information about a particular fund or ESG initiative, while you sort of felt like if you had gone down a different rabbit hole, you might have found a completely different information. Like choose your own adventure is what it kind of felt like sometimes. So another and the final thing that I'll touch on for overall project findings, excuse me, were the complex corporate structures. And you know, this is kind of a reality of the world that we live in, but companies sort of expect everybody to know what's going on internally and how their businesses are structured. So this makes it really difficult for an individual to parse through, you know, okay, this is the bank end of the company, this is the fund manager business line. You know, it's difficult if you don't really know what these entities are and how they interact with each other. So let's move on to banks. So we found, you know, I'm just generally going to go over a few different statistics that we found. Banks are more public-facing entities, and they have generally more people employed by them. And we found that this may or may not have been impacted their response on Black Lives Matter. So about 2/3 of the banks that we looked at have a statement and an action related to the Black Lives Matter movement. On COVID, there was not such a great response. Only 5 banks responded on COVID-specific initiatives. For the task force on financial disclosures, 2/3 of banks have a statement. Task force on carbon-related financial disclosure. And on fossil fuel investments, many of the larger banks we researched continue to have fossil fuel investments. But we did find that some banks are starting to refocus on renewables. For Black, Asian, and minority ethnic board members, only 2 banks have self-identified board members or report on BAME representation on their board. Many companies do not at all explicitly report this figure. Just a note on BAME, BAME board members were not identified by site from our researchers. Researchers looked for evidence that the company had reported on self-identified BAME board members. So I think that if we want to further this discussion, companies need to be upfront with this figure. Okay. And next we'll go to pension funds. So we had a hard time finding information from pension funds. Many of them are behind firewalls that are only relevant to members, and it made it difficult, and we generally had less of a response from pension funds overall as well. So what we did find was that they have good showings on climate actions and TCFD, and great UCSIF membership, and a good commitment from across the pension funds to report under the 2020 Stewardship Code. We found a lack of information on ESG related data points overall. And then, as I mentioned, the feedback from pension funds was that not many of these pension funds are available to individual investors. And we really see that this is a potential for individuals to petition their pension funds to ask what they're doing on salient issues and how their investments support and further, current goals and climate actions and greener and fairer recovery. Next is the funds portfolio. So we researched individual funds and analyzed their portfolios based on VE data. And so just a quick overview, carbon footprint of the funds overall is significantly less than the market more broadly. So about 20% of funds had 2 times the market exposure to sustainable goods and services. So we think that's a pretty good thing. The funds were also noticeably better on sustainable development goals, but the funds were similar to the market on energy transition to low carbon, and equal opportunities and HR issues were also similar to the market. In those, there's always outliers, so some funds do better than the market, but we do want to mention that it was difficult for us to adjust for size on this. So next, we'll look at fund managers' approaches. We looked at more broadly, what is the fund manager doing across the firm? So 2/3 of fund managers have no statement on Black Lives Matter. And only 4 fund managers have disclosed either having self-identified BAME board members or targets to increase the number of BAME board members. But fund managers are rather strong on climate action and TCFD. So just briefly overall, we found that the lack of accessible disclosures from companies did really hamper our research and our research and then the subsequent reporting. So we would urge companies to sort of report more, not always more wordy, but more substantive content. Aside from the banks, people haven't really, companies haven't really reacted to Black Lives Matter in detail. You know, we'd like to see a better response from this. Some companies have picked up the SDGs, but it does seem like others have glossed over them or identified a few SDGs that are relevant to the firm, but you know, haven't looked at the Sustainable Development Goals holistically across the firm. And we found that, you know, reporting is more significant and detailed when it's regulated. And this is kind of an obvious finding, but we did want to note that, you know, given the upcoming ESG related regulations, this is interesting and we hope it gets furthered. So again, quality does not equal quantity. Longer reporting is not necessarily better reporting. And we are a long way from sustainable financial systems, but there are leaders, and we hope that firms will identify and recognize those leaders, a lot of which are here today, and sort of use those best practices across and share with other companies. So lastly, this is my information. If you should have any questions, we urge you to reach out, and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Mandy. That was really great, really interesting. So we've heard from the investors. We've got an idea of where they stand on this. We've heard from the researchers and heard how difficult it is to find information that investors would find relevant for sustainability and ethical and ESG issues. So, but it does sound like the industry is doing a lot, you know, different institutions are doing different things, but you know, we're doing something, and so people should know that. So let's move on now to the providers and just hear about how you are trying to better educate the retail market around sustainable investment, and how you can get more people interested in this type of investment and helping to build back better in the UK. So let's start with Bill Hartnett, if we can, ESG Stewardship Director at Aberdeen Standard Investments.
Oh, good afternoon, and thanks very much for having me participate in the UCSIF panel for Good Money Week. Look, I'm actually an Australian. I've come here 18 months ago, and these sort of figures are interesting, and the whole concept of responsible investment has long-term had appeal in, I suppose, in the UK, but also globally. And this, I'm a bit surprised to see the figures that we're seeing here, that the low take up on sustainability or interest in it in the COVID environment, because it goes a bit counter to what we've been seeing in other areas in the institutional area. The PwC report that was quoted there as well, we're seeing strong uptake in and interest in this area, but it always does come down to these issues around performance, around criterias, and around developing impact and strategies. And this has been something that has hindered the growth of the industry for some time, because, and a lot of them I think you'll find are myths, because as we're seeing, as the growth in the industry is strong, certainly we've seen during COVID that the performance of ESG related funds have generally outperformed non-ESG or impact funds in this time. And that can be, you know, a focus of ESG typically looking at better quality and governance of companies, ESG funds often being in industries and sectors that may not be sunset industries. So, you know, a lesser, you know, some of the industries that really got impacted by COVID, such as the oil and gas industry, have often had, you know, big headwinds in terms of sustainability more generally. So with these headwinds and these opportunities, and, you know, we've got to say the opportunities are outweighing the headwinds now, the direction of travel is there. It's really all about transparency and continuing to teach people and educate people about, you know, something, you know, sustainability and investments were never the twain shall meet for many years, but that's no longer the case. So what we're doing is really, it's demonstrating commitment. We've been in this area of ESG integration for over 30 years, putting resources in this area. We've done a lot of it internally, but now we're rolling it out more externally. So specific examples that we've had, we've got training sessions for IFAs. We've been doing them in person, but also virtually. Our website contains more and more information about ESG issues. So we have position statements on 12 contentious or interesting areas around responsible investment through, biodiversity, diversity, inclusion, climate change, fossil fuels, nuclear, water, tax, remuneration, a whole wide gamut of what should we expect, what are the risks, what are the opportunities, what are the approaches that we're doing. Simply, we have, thought leadership pieces, thinking aloud pieces, that were also enunciating our experts' views on what we see as the key trends and how it can apply to retail and institutional investors. We've worked strongly on trying to get categorizations of funds going through developing sustainable fund, investment fund approachment documents. And then we've, also just really trying to boost our real life reporting. So we do quarterly engagement reports on what we've been doing, and that's actually an area that I'm in. So in the last quarterly engagement report, we'll talk about AstraZeneca and our discussions with them and their approach to rolling out a vaccine for COVID and how they're going, what the opportunities, will it be in developed markets, will it be in emerging markets? We talk about Shell and Total and our engagements with them on encouraging them to set net zero carbon alliances, carbon targets. We'll talk around board structure and remuneration issues at different companies. We'll talk about opioid addictions and others. I mean, I suppose this highlights some of the trends and opportunities and issues with ESG is that there is such a broad and wide range of issues that you have to cover. And we're just trying to give, I suppose, snapshots on how we do it. And we increase to do that by doing reporting on our voting statistics and our engagement statistics as well. So it's a showing by doing approach, I think, is what we'll see, but we will continue to systematize our approach to reporting for retail and wholesale investors so that we will have mandatory scoring on ESG portfolio scores, on carbon metrics and footprinting and active ownership type statistics. And that's something that we'd like to be rolling out across all our funds over the course of 2021. So they're just a flesh of examples that we're doing as a flesh out of examples that we're doing across the entire group.
Thanks so much, Bill. That was really great. Thank you. Lots of information there for people. So let's move on now to Mike Appleby, Investment Manager at Lion Trust. Perhaps you can tell us a bit about what you're doing.
Thanks, Charlene. Yeah, so there are three main areas we've been working on to try and better educate the retail end of the market. So the first one is really focusing on advisors who we think are key because they're giving advice to people as to where they should be investing. So we've done a lot of educational pieces to lots of IFA networks, literally thousands of people I've presented to and our team has presented to over the last 3 years to try and get them to understand exactly what sustainable investment is, how it affects the investment decision, and how to better understand it. So I think that's key. The second area is working with our regulators. So we were involved in a consultation with UCSIF around the IA, trying to reclassify, what sustainable investment funds are. Didn't really get the result we wanted, but it's a step better in the right direction. I think the key there is that these aren't mutually exclusive. You have bits of a portfolio that are avoiding certain parts of the market, are exposed to certain things that have positive impacts from their products and services. And some of those you may be able to have measurable impacts. Some of them that's work in progress. And then that quality of conversation you're having on engagement. So that's the second area. And then the last bit, really echoing what Bill said, it's really about being transparent. And I think the key here is to replace jargon with simple, clear language that's backed up with data. So unfortunately, one of the two barriers to people getting into sustainable investment have always been no one really understands what sustainable means, and they're worried that they're going to lose money. Now, the second one, there are really good investment funds with long-term track records that haven't just lucked out because they didn't own oil in COVID, but have got really good long-term track records that are competitive versus their mainstream peers. I'm not saying that all sustainable funds are going to outperform in all market conditions, but I'm saying, you know, that idea that you have to give up investment returns by investing in this investment style is just no longer true. The facts don't bear that out. And so I think what's happened is everyone loves a buzzword, and then the marketing departments get hold of the buzzword, and you know, environmental protection has turned into natural capital, and then it's turning into various bits of impact and stuff. And I think that's where, and ESG means different things to different people. It's now beginning to mean how a company's managed, or how it's managing its ESG bits. But there's no, so I think bin the acronyms and just say proactive management of a business and how it interacts with environment, society. Talk about what the services, products and services actually do in our economy. And I think that that is the way forward. And I'll stop there.
Yeah, totally agree with everything you said there, Mike. Thank you so much for that. Alexia, can you tell us what you're doing at Stewart Investors?
Yep, sure. So thank you so much for letting me join today's panel. There's no doubt that the investment management industry has got a really key role to play in encouraging more people to become interested in sustainable investment and boost those numbers that you found on this latest polling. Unfortunately, or maybe unsurprisingly, the 2019 Edelman Trust Barometer indicates that the finance industry remains the least trusted business sector, and is often and quite rightly blamed for failing to address the great social and environmental challenges of our time. So as investment managers, we absolutely have a responsibility to encourage a savings culture around long-term investment for the benefits of society. So we absolutely need to convince people of the power of their investments in having an impact, and to most importantly make it feel achievable and not completely overwhelming by a barrage of acronyms and synonyms, lots of different words basically meaning the same thing to many people. So we at the Sustainable Funds Group absolutely need to do more to help educate retail investors about sustainability, and also need to think more about the channels in which we communicate with retail investors. But there are definitely some actions that we are starting to take to hopefully start to make a difference. So the biggest initiative is our microsite, which we launched earlier this year. And this site is actually ungated. So unlike so much of the investment industry's content, it's not reserved just for institutional investors. The main feature on the site is an interactive map, which allows all our clients and stakeholders to easily access full investment rationales on every company held across every single one of our investment strategies that we manage. We list the points for each company that we are engaging on or plan to engage on, and the risks associated with the company and the sustainable development goals that each company supports. It's so important that investment managers start to talk more openly about the risks of the companies they're invested in, as well as the benefits. So a great example is Nestle. Whilst the company is definitely moving in the right direction in terms of access to nutrition, supply chains and packaging, it does still face an enormous sustainability headwind from bottled water. So we often say there is no such thing as a perfect company, but too often we're seeing the positives expressed without the negatives for really large, complex and evolving companies like Nestle. And as a business, it's quite a tightrope to walk, because we're really wary of giving the impression of using sustainability as a marketing tool, but we are starting to be a little bit noisier about what we mean by sustainability. So having launched our first sustainability fund back in 2005, we are beginning to try and challenge the greenwash that's out there and the sort of increasing window dressing that's going on by parts of the investment management industry. But anything we do publish does need to be quite a clear representation of the Sustainable Funds Group, which does lead us for a preference for high quality written work by our investment team. And actually, most recently, David Gate, who's the head of our investment team, did write an article called Through the Looking Glass. It's a sequel to another article he wrote a few years ago called Alice in Finance Land. And they both focus on the role of the industry in society and how the finance world is increasingly becoming a little bit more akin to Lewis Carroll's Fantasyland, focused on metric fixation and short-term speculation. So really, I suppose what I'm saying is, how can retail investors build faith in an industry when quite often the worse a company's sustainability impact is, often the likelihood of a high ESG rating might be. A great example is India's leading tobacco company, which has an AA ESG rating and sits near the top of at least 2 ESG benchmarks, courtesy of its size and its sizable glossy ESG report. But absolutely, actions speak louder than words. So we are working on articulating the impact of our investment portfolios in a way that we hope is a bit more relatable than sort of aggregated ESG ratings and climate statistics. So, for example, much of the investment discussion and reporting of the climate crisis very much focuses on backward-looking footprinting and speculative scenario analysis, which really isn't that easy for anyone to relate to. So we think there needs to be a greater focus on real-world solutions. And we've been working with an externally validated list of climate change solutions from an independent research charity called Project Drawdown. And the project's basically catalogued 80 climate change solutions with the potential to meet the Paris climate change goal. Now, many of these solutions would be expected, such as onshore wind and utility scale solar. But what is striking, I would say, is not the big ticket items, but the diversity of solutions that are out there, including supporting female education and the shift to plant-rich diets. Hopefully, reporting like this will help our retail customers understand much more broadly about the real-world impacts of their investments, rather than it being a sort of aggregated list of statistics and ratings, which are very difficult to relate to. So there's lots more that we need to do, yeah, we'll just continue trying to make our reporting more meaningful and reflective of what it is that we're doing on a day-to-day basis.
Thanks, Alexia. That was really great. And I'm glad that you raised the trust point at the beginning. I found that what's been really interesting about this event and yesterday's event, where we asked for questions up front, most of them have been around greenwash. And so it's really clear, just even from us asking people to submit their questions in advance, that there is a trust issue here. So yeah, we need to do more, and what you're doing sounds really great. Okay, so, let's move on to Alistair McQueen, Head of Savings and Retirement at Aviva.
1 second. Hello. Hi there, Charlene. Thank you for the invitation. And there's 3 things as Aviva, large pension provider, we would like to talk through. I'm going to talk about Money Talks, what I mean by that. I'm going to talk about the brilliance of Good Money Week. And then I'm going to talk about where Aviva sees ESG today. But before I go there, I wanted to start by saying happy birthday. I think happy 15th birthday to Good Money Week. I read on your website your start in 2005. I would argue ahead of your time, but the time has now come for the subject of Good Money and Good Money Week. Why do I say that? Well, clearly I'm thinking of the situation we find ourselves in now, the COVID pandemic and the associated lockdown, which has forced all of us, whether we're in this industry or not, to pause, stop and reflect and ask, maybe we want to go in a different direction. And I'm sure at the height of lockdown, we all had our own reflections on the quiet streets around us, the clear skies and the bird song, and made us realize that maybe there was another way. And the challenge, as Charlene said up front, is can we build back better? So let me just get into money talks. Many people out there that we seek to serve will maybe primarily look to the government to play its part in making the world a better place, and indeed they have a role to play. And they play their role significantly. I think the government in this country invests more than £20 billion every year on climate protection and the environment. That's a lot of money. But then when you put it into the context of money itself and individual investment, the government spends £20 billion a year on this. £75 billion every year gets invested in the ISA market. So that's nearly more than 3 times what the government's investing. And a multiple of that will be going into private pensions. Private pensions is the biggest home of private wealth in the United Kingdom, £6,000 billion of private wealth sitting in pensions in the United Kingdom. Yet most people in those markets don't fully appreciate the power of their pensions to make them a force for good. So money talks, and people have power to make their money talk significantly. And that brings me to the brilliance of Good Money Week. And they need to raise awareness, they need to engage the industry and to engage end consumers in this debate. And there's a huge amount of engagement that needs to get done in this country. Why would I say that? Well, if you look at financial literacy in this country, it's below the OECD average, yet we continue to use jargon and words and a language that even we would struggle to get our head around. We're not speaking to our population in a way that works for them. And in my sector, the pension sector, we've got a record number of people saving in private pensions today than we've ever had, yet most people claim they don't really understand what a pension is or how it works. So people have got the power, but they do not know how to use it. And that's where Good Money Week can come in, and we can take a step today to engage, educate, and empower people to take advantage. Some research that Aviva found is that 80% of people we serve said they want investments to be a force for good. 40% of that population did not appreciate that their pension was an investment that could be used as a force for good. So there's a massive gap in this market, and indeed a massive opportunity for us on the provider side to serve what is a growing and hungry market. And then where do we think ESG in this world is now? Well, I would describe it with 3-letter N's. I would say niche, new, but now. Why do I say niche? Well, our research suggests that fewer than 20% of the people that we serve are actively considering this as an option. Why do I say new? Well, of those 20%, half of them have just stepped into this market in the last 6 months, demonstrating the growth and interest that there is in this market. And why do I say now? Well, our own research shows that 80% of people are thinking of moving into this market in the future. So we are seeing a population of people where 1 in 5 are looking at it today. We believe that 4 in 5 will actively look at it tomorrow. And it's up for us as individuals in this industry to decide whether we want to take advantage of that market. And then I just close by bringing out some 3 interesting quotes that makes us all decide which side of this fence we choose to sit on. I think all the people speaking are on the advocate sides, but there may be some on the other sides. I'm reminded of the manager of the Decca music label who said to the Beatles, guitar groups are on the way out, and decided this was not the place to be. I'm reminded of Ronald Wayne, who sold his 10% stake in Apple for $800, and that 10% stake is now worth $100 billion. And I'm thinking of the boss of Tim Berners-Lee, who described the invention of the World Wide Web back in the day as vague but maybe interesting. You may choose to be Decca, you may choose to be Ronald Wayne, or you may choose to be the boss of Tim Berners-Lee. Aviva's choosing not to be those people because we believe there's an appetite and there's a market here that we need to serve. And that's where Good Money Week can come in and help us engage our people in this market. So I'll hand back to you, Charlene.
Thank you so much. Niche, new, and now. I love that. That's great. Okay, so we did ask our audience to submit questions when they registered. So we do have a list of questions. I just want to ask a quick question before we move on to those. And Mandy, I think I'll start with you on this one. It's about outcomes reporting. So I think what we've seen generally in the past is a lot of activity reporting when it comes to how fund managers are investing our money. So things like we attended, 20 meetings with the board of X this year and that type of thing, but we don't really hear actually what the outcomes of those conversations were. I know it's getting better, and I've seen some of your case studies from some of the businesses on the panel today, and they're looking great. But is this just something that the industry needs to improve on, more outcomes reporting? Mandy, what did you find when you were doing the research?
I think companies are very aware of this type of reporting, and they'd like to sort of be doing more of it. It does seem like quantifying the impacts is a really difficult thing for companies to do. So, there are very specific, bespoke sort of impact reporting, but it's company by company. And I think once we have a better understanding of how we can collectively report on impact, I think that will sort of help normalize and standardize in this industry. So.
Yeah. Bill, is there anything that you can talk about in terms of outcomes reporting as the Stewardship Director at Aberdeen Standard?
Sorry, it's my time to unmute. Look, it is a challenge. From a stewardship perspective, you are looking at often what are very long-term engagements. We do a lot of work and we report on a lot of work, say, for example, in climate change transition, and getting, oil and gas companies to, as an example, because, it is still a significant industry that's providing dividends, to get them onto a net zero strategy. And this is not something that happens overnight. These are turning, literally, huge ships around to change their strategies, and working with companies in a constructive way of doing that. So you can do reports on that and the outcome and measure the performance, but it is more difficult to do. I would say things like the taxonomy regulation that is coming through, that will be asking for increased reporting on sustainable funds, on percentage of sustainable activities benchmarked against the predefined ratios of what are sustainable activities, is going to help enormously in continuing to improve consumer confidence. At the moment, I would say, around the greenwash area, or that area around outcomes, it's the impact funds that are really where we see are the best ones that are able to do the impact. So and the outcomes measurement. So we have a global equity impact fund that has references the 17 SDGs distilled against our 8 pillars, and we're able to give of 8 pillars of sustainability and impact, and we're able to give aggregate figures on each of those, the impact of each of those pillars and the impact from that, and real world figures. And we're able to give case studies, examples on why we're studying and investing in each of those companies and what they are contributing. So it is possible to do, but this is it's at this stage still a pretty labor-intensive process to do. And you need the scale of people behind it to support it too. So it is a bit chicken and egg. So we're very strong supporters of taxonomy and getting more benchmark type reporting that will help drive through this outcome related impact activities.
Yeah, thanks. That was a great answer. Does anyone else want to add anything to that? Do you think you can?
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, if I could, I was just going back to one of the things said about additionality. If you're invested in a stock market, whether you own the shares or someone else owns the shares, it doesn't have any impact, whatever. I would refute that. I think if you are generating your income or your pension is invested in a coal-fired generator that makes electricity and emits huge amounts of CO2, or it's invested, you know, in a renewable energy generator that operates renewable energy thing, which still produces energy, but none of the CO2. I think there's a very big difference there. And I think that there are a few levels that you can look at this. So one of them is following on from that intuitively, you can see how there are positive impacts from companies where the majority of their business is all about providing a more sustainable product or service, be that energy efficiency or cleaner energy, etc. And then we're beginning to see more very specific, you know, key performance indicators about, you know, how much CO2 this company is offsetting as a result of the products and services they provide. And typically in water treatment and stuff like that, that's quite easy. But this is evolving, and there are lots of impacts that are actually quite tricky to try and measure and try and understand. That's not to say it's not worth looking at this. And if you're saying that you have a very sustainable company that has a massive positive impact, at some stage you're going to need to measure that impact. You might not be able to do it today, but on your time horizon over the next 2, 3 to 5 years, if you can't measure what that positive impact is, then maybe you shouldn't be claiming how positive that company is indeed, because if you really can't measure it. So what I see in this is that people are wanting to understand more about the outcomes, and we're going to see much more disclosure of this going forward. And then the other area is to do with engagement. So for example, with COVID-19, we've been really actively engaging with companies to take a much longer term view of their stakeholders, and rather than binning all their staff as quickly as they can and refusing to pay their suppliers, that we want them to be ready for the recovery, which I know feels, we don't know where that's going to be now, but there will be one. And so that quality of the conversation you're having is really, really important. And there you can mention outcomes as a result of how we voted on gender, for example, on boards. And there's still a long way to go, but there has been movement. We're not claiming that's all down to us. And I think the other thing is to do with the pace of change. This is really, really important because there's a lot that's happened, but it's happening really slowly. It's happening too slowly. And so things like our 1.5 degree energy transition challenge, all of the companies we own, we're speaking to them and saying, look, we know you've got decarbonisation targets and that's great, but your decarbonisation target compared to what the science is saying, which is basically saying we need to halve our emissions every decade for the next 3 decades. Please go back and be more ambitious about your targets and try and make them more in the context of what the science is telling us. So that is, and what response we've got from them. So many of them are coming back and are indeed re-looking at those intentions. So I think there are a few areas where you can look at outcomes, but it is very important. Another one I would say is looking at in listed equities, looking at the record of voting at AGMs, because there's a very big difference between a fund manager who is just voting with management all the time and thinks everything's A-OK, and one that is really holding into account and maybe over half the time is voting against or abstaining, at least on some resolutions, with the intention of getting that company to be even better at how they manage their business. So I think those are some areas that we will see more and more disclosure. And I believe that investors that really care about this will start to differentiate on those bits of information, because it gives them a much better idea of actually what's going on in the fund and what the people that are making the investment decisions think about the challenges we've got and how they're implementing them in the shape of the portfolio.
Thanks, Mike. That was great. And yeah, I completely agree with that. I mean, it's really clear that there's a trust issue and we're going to need to see more of this type of reporting. So absolutely agree. Sorry, was somebody about to jump in there?
Yeah, it's Alistair. And one of the brilliant things about Good Money Week is the chance that we have in these virtual times to hear different perspectives. When it comes to things like outcome reporting in this debate, I see that as a step 2 challenge. I think we're still on step 1. And by step 1, I mean opening up the eyes of the public to this great opportunity that there is in ESG, SRI type investing. You hear about people talking about left side brain thinking, right side brain thinking. I can never quite remember. I think left side is the analytical, methodical thinking. Right side is the creative, emotive thinking, the engagement thinking. I fear as an industry, we are too heavy on the left side, the analytical, the methodical, the taxonomy, the additionality thinking. That's brilliant. We've got that nailed. I think what we need to do is a challenge for the industry to turn up the right side of our brain, to wake up the millions of people out there who don't maybe think like us within our walls of our industry, and engage with them in a language that works for them, with the emotions and the motives that clearly are there for them. Report after report after report will show the priority with which people place good business and business doing good. My fear is that if we talk to them in our language, we will miss that opportunity and we'll walk straight past them. So more right brain thinking, less left brain thinking would be my challenge to us.
Yeah, thanks. And some of the suggestions that we put in the report actually around communication and what really helped people to make more sustainable decisions when it came to their money were things like more storytelling and presenting information in different ways. So using more video, being more present online and telling stories. And I think actually with outcomes, you can tell stories around those things. And yeah, I feel we're missing a bit of that. It'd be really good to see more of it. Okay, so I think we're going to move on to some of the questions that came in. I'm going to stick with stewardship for the moment. Here's one from Emmett McNamee. He asked, how are we going to empower retail investors in stewardship decisions? Alistair, actually, I'm going to start with you.
Come off mute. Well, empowering customers, I think the approach that Aviva is going to take generally is we're going to look at the power of digital in this arena. We think the financial services sector, certainly my industry, the pension sector, is asleep at the wheel when it comes to its potential use of digital technology. If you look at the banking sector, 8 out of 10 people in banking use the internet to manage their money. 1 out of 10 use it for managing long-term investing in pensions. We've got this brilliant tool that unites 4 billion people around the world, but we're not taking advantage of it. So our challenge and our effort and our energy in this area is using digital technology as a means of empowering the individual. This money belongs to the individual. This money is their money, and our responsibility is to help them take control of their money. And one of the areas that we'll be doing that is within the digital arena.
Amazing, thank you. Does anyone else have any comments on that? How we can encourage more retail investors to take part in stewardship decisions?
Hi,
Yes.
Bill Hartnett.
Yeah, Bill, go for it.
Yeah, sorry. Look, I would just say it's getting back to these things about education and transparency. And, you know, for example, if you want them involved, you've got to know what's happening. But there's, you know, we vote on 5,200 companies every year. We engage on 1,500 companies a year. So there's a huge amount of information that has to be distilled out there. So we are just publishing more on our expectations on a variety of different issues. We will escalate at times on management against companies when we're dissatisfied with their responses. We will put down the rationale for how we vote at an AGM the day after, and that's available on our website right now. So all the information is out there, I suppose, and you know, digital would be maybe, as was previously said, it's been connecting the dot on, wow, this is such an incredibly strong force that can be there with the institutional investor and retail investors applying stewardship next to it, how do you actually get them engaged on that? But I think the first building block there, that we are getting our expectations, our understandings, what we want on climate change, what the approaches that we see that we should be happening on there. And then I suppose it is to get that communication and getting the retail investor along on the ride with what is, a potentially very, very powerful tool.
Thanks, Bill. Alexia, was that you that wanted to jump in as well?
Yeah, that was, sorry. So largely repeating similar points about the importance of transparency and retail investors understanding what it is that is actually held in their portfolios, but also there are a number of great initiatives out there which are emerging. I can't resist the opportunity, I'm afraid, to flag the Big Exchange, which we were delighted to be a founding supporter of. And the platform launched only last week. Hopefully it's got great media coverage. Hopefully lots of you have read all about it. But what it is, it's a platform that allows savers to invest for as little as £25 a month in funds which have been independently rated and awarded with gold, silver or bronze medals for their positive contributions to the planet and people. And what it is really providing, hopefully, is jargon-free, easy, mobile-based access, allowing retail investors to actually match their consumer preferences that they make every day with their investments.
Thanks, Alexia. Okay, I'm going to move into some of the other questions. A lot of them are about greenwash and mis-selling. So I'll start with this one. Chris Toy, he asks, is ESG the next mis-selling scandal? Mike, would you like to start with that one?
Yeah, I don't think so. I think that one of the things that particularly gets talked about in the press is that ESG, all the funds are exactly the same. And they're not. There are, and the providers are not all the same. There are some specialist teams, of which I would count myself part of, that have been doing this for 20 years and who have, master's degrees in things like environmental management stuff, have really gone quite a long way away from a conventional investment fund that run very concentrated portfolios. But that said, are there funds that are perhaps overstating their sustainability credentials? I think there probably are. And I think that it's important that, I think it goes back to this thing that for private investors, there is a lot going on in making a decision about which funds you should be invested in. And I think a lot of the due diligence that should be happening with your independent advisor, who will be looking at funds through a process whereby they're able to catch, better managed funds than worse managed funds. And that includes the usual risk returns and the track record that they have, the stability of the team, or all these kinds of things, as well as being able to spot whether some of the claims being made in the marketing literature are very difficult to see or evidence in the data, if any, that's being disclosed. So I don't think ESG is any different than many things. There are good sustainable investment funds, and there will be, unfortunately, some which are not as good. And I would suggest that an advisor is best placed to, it's their job to filter that out and find what's appropriate for you, given your investment objectives, as well as your sustainability views and how far up you want that sustainability element in there. Whether investing in some companies that are going to be part of this transition but have a long way to go, but engaging with them, whether that's okay. For some people, that's fine. For other people, that's not good enough. And working out where along this spectrum of sustainability is appropriate for you to be invested. I think it's something it's tough to do on your own at home, and get professional help. That's what I suggest.
Yeah, I'd just like to echo Mike's sentiments about the differentiation between fund managers and different funds. I mean, we saw a huge range of different focuses of individual funds. You know, for instance, some managers have one fund that they manage, and so you're really choosing the fund manager because you want that specific type of fund, you know, and others have a broad range of different focuses, from ESG related funds all the way to sort of more traditional funds. So I think it is important to work with your investment advisor to really choose the right funds for you. And, you know, another tool for that is the Fund Eco Market tool that we used, which has a list of fund managers and specific funds that, you know, you can sort of sort through as an individual to try and find things that are most relevant to you and your values. So I would suggest that tool as well.
Thanks, Mandy. Does anyone else want to comment on that before I move on to the next question?
Yeah, I think on the subject of greenwashing, I agree. The advisor's role, I would highlight the Ethical Investment Association for a useful catalogue of advisors that could help individuals in this area. I would point to the regulator. Don't walk around with the belief that the regulator is blind to this question of greenwashing, both at the European level and at the UK level. There's a lot of work going on there to ensure that a fund does what it says on the tin. And I think also I'd say to the individual, you have got an individual responsibility and individual control as well. If you invest your money with your fund and you're not convinced that fund is doing what it says in the tin, you've got complete control and empowerment to move that money elsewhere. So you've got that power to vote with your feet, and don't feel that you do not. And if you do walk away, then the fund concerned will realize that they're not doing what they're being asked of them. So advisor responsibility, regulator responsibility, and some individual responsibility as well.
Thank you.
I would just,
sorry, Alexa.
if I could just add one more comment, which is actually a little bit more damning on the industry, unfortunately, and does make me think there is a bit of a risk of a mis-selling scandal if we're not careful. I think there are two areas. One, passive indexes, and there are many indexes out there which call themselves low carbon indices. And if I was quite new to the space and maybe didn't understand it fully, I would think, brilliant, there's no way I'll have exposure to heavy carbon fossil fuel businesses if I invest in a low carbon indice. Straight up, that's not the case. And the way the indices are rebalanced, investors still would have exposure. So I think that's probably a mis-selling risk that retail investors should be aware of. And the other thing that does worry me is there are a huge number, I wish I had the stats to hand, but of course I never do at the right time. There are a huge number of funds that have been launched in the last sort of year or two, which really are based entirely on third-party ESG ratings from the large research houses that we all know and love. And I guess the challenge with that is so many of these ratings rate companies according to, I don't know, historic disclosures, policies and processes. Because company A has a climate policy and sets an emission reduction target, they'll receive full marks, even if the targets are weak and their products are in fact environmentally damaging. And I think a retail investor that comes to an ESG fund wouldn't expect that to be the case. So I think it probably is a risk, and that's where we have to be as transparent as we can about what it is that we are doing before all sustainability funds get tarred with the same brush.
Thanks, Alexia. That was a bit of a segue into the next question, actually. This one's from Aaron Gade, and he asked, why would I ever invest in passive ESG? Bill, do you have an answer?
Well, we're an active manager, so look, I won't put a comment on that, but I could say what we think are the benefits of active investments, and I think we're getting into some definitions of the type of investments here. We've been talking about impact funds that can be much more targeted, but then when you're talking about more broad thematic type or broad sector indice type funds, you have the options of a type of passive fund or an active type of fund. And this is where you're really trying to cover a broad remit of activities. And why we think active is better in this situation is that you don't necessarily have to replicate the actual index. So if you are taking, and it serves the purpose of stewardship better, we think there is a very strong role to be said to be a responsible owner. And you know, it gets back to that previous question around greenwashing. The number one thing to do is to check the resources that the fund manager is actually devoting into ESG, because it's not an easy area to cover so easily. You know, or you just start relying on those sorts of ticker box type mentalities and approaches. But if you have an active approach where you are able to look at risks and identify ESG as a risk, then being an active manager where you might get to the stage, well, I might be satisfied with some oil companies or some gas companies on how they're trying to transition to carbon, or I might be happy with some mining companies on how they're dealing with Indigenous rights and license to operate issues, but I may not be satisfied with all of them. And if that is combined with not being happy about the outlook for the company more generally, it's a great reason not to be in there. So it's a very strong case for looking at active management as opposed to passive, because with passive, you could be just sailing with the ship down the creek.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. Does anyone else want to comment on that? Passive versus active. Why would anyone choose passive?
Yeah, I thought it was a great question, made me laugh. As an active investor, I echo your thoughts entirely. Why would you? And I think the reason is really because, generally speaking, fees in passive funds are much lower. And so if you don't believe active managers ever really add any value, then that's why people go into passives. But I would just caution that I would echo what Alexia was saying, that there are a lot of people buying third-party ratings on ESG without fully understanding how those ratings are built and what they're really measuring. So you're getting some weird outcomes there, which you wouldn't get with people that have been doing this for a while, I don't think, or the chance of that happening are much lower. But in our experience, passive investing, we are unashamedly active investors. Each of our funds will typically only have 40 or 50 stocks in them, not because we can't find any more ideas than that, because we do a lot of work and due diligence on a company and we want to hold it for a long time, typically 5 years or longer. And that's how we think you're going to have the most meaningful conversations with companies over longer periods of time as very engaged investors. And I think what all passive investing does suffer from is you are investing in something just because it's there. It's in the benchmark, and therefore, if you're not invested in that, your risks are you're basically trying to mirror a benchmark. And we think this idea that you're looking at something that's happened in the past is perhaps not a forward-looking way of investing. But for some people, passive ESG might work. It's not something we advocate or do, but for some that might work.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next question. This one's from Paul Bryant, and he asked, how do you approach the dilemma? Should I only invest in what's already good, or should I invest to improve? Alistair, do you want to give that one a go?
Good question. I'm trying to get my head around that good question. I think my fundamental point here would be the basics of diversification. And nobody in this industry would advocate having all of our investment eggs in one basket. And by doing so, you build our own knowledge and our own experience, and we diversify our risk. We all understand that. So my response to that direct question would be a bit of both in the spirit of diversification. So yes, support those who are leading the way, but secondly, challenge those who have got some catching up to do. And echoing the previous points about active fund management, that active engagement in the industry allows us to challenge those who have got some catching up to do to do that catching up. So I'll go with a bit of both in response to that direct question.
Thanks. Mandy, I wonder if you've got an answer to this question. I mean, the research you were doing was from the perspective of an individual investor, and you had a real good look at the industry and how it is improving and the things that they're starting to do. What would you say to investing in what's already good, or investing to improve?
I think this was a dilemma that we faced in how to capture that in particular. We had a couple of examples from fund managers that, you know, had a couple of companies in their portfolios that they were engaging with and working to working along the transition to low carbon. So, you know, an oil and gas company that is focused on transitioning to renewables, but right now they're an oil and gas company. And, you know, that's something I think we will try and sort out in future iterations of the project. But I think again, it's important to know what your fund manager is doing, how they engage with companies, and really understanding that process of where they see the future of their portfolios. I think that's really important.
Thanks.
Can I say something?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, there's no right answer to that. It depends on you as an investor. It goes back to saying this is why there's some confusion about it, that, you know, what is ESG? Well, it depends on your view. For some people, they don't mind being invested in oil and gas companies. They fill up their car with petrol, and as long as their oil and gas company is being proactive and it's moving in a positive manner and is investing in renewables, that's great. So for some people, that's great. Personally, for me, I think that's a joke. I wouldn't want to be invested in an oil and gas company because they're exactly the wrong side of the energy transition. I would much rather be invested in companies that are growing as a result of the energy transition and not investing into lower investment returns than they've been used to in the past, and therefore going to suffer from a structural headwind. There's no right answer to that. I'm not better than someone who wants to be invested in oil and gas companies. That's why it's important to talk to your independent advisor and explain things like that. And then they can go and pick a fund that's relevant for you. But I do think that if you are invested in parts of the market that are towards the less sustainable end, that unless you're engaging with them to improve the way in which they're managed, I'd really question why you're invested in them at all, for me personally. But for some people, that's fine. So that goes on to that first part of the question where people are confused about what sustainable means. And the answer is it means slightly different things to different people, because their level at which they're prepared to invest in terms of how sustainable it is, how much the investment decision is being affected by those sustainability aspects is going to be slightly different. And that's why we have lots of slightly different approaches to it. And I think that's a strength, even though it makes it slightly more complicated. But I don't think there is a right answer. It's up to the individual whether they want to be invested, for example, in a proactive oil and gas company or not.
Yeah, could I just add one very, very quick point to what Mike just said, which I do completely agree with. I think it's important that investors are aware that if they do want to invest sustainably, and whatever that sustainability might mean to that investor, there are thousands and thousands and thousands of companies out there. And if you are investing with a fund manager who's investing in 40 companies, let's say, there is no need to invest in a fossil fuel company, because there are so many companies out there which do have a positive sustainability impact. So don't feel you need to be focused on that. I think I need to be invested in a fossil fuel company, to the engagement argument, because it isn't actually necessary. There are enough great opportunities out there not to be exposed to areas that might concern you.
Thanks, Alexia. Okay, so we've got 5 more minutes. So I'm going to ask one last question, and I'm not going to say who this question's from because I don't want to throw them under the bus, but they're from a fund manager, and they're asking, how can we encourage upper management that this focus on ESG and retail investors is necessary? So you're all leaders in this, you've been doing it for a really long time, but was there a time when, you know, there was a lot of internal convincing to do that ESG was important, that the retail market on this was important? Are there any sort of tips that you can share? How do we get this through? Who should we start with? Should we start with Bill?
Look, I'm going to say my own personal experience has been much more on the institutional side, and also from Australia. But you know, I think what you've got to do is try to have this end focus on the member or the end investor, on whose money you're investing on behalf of, and this idea of investing sustainably and around ESG has, you know, a cake and eat it too aspect to it. You know, if you can get good sustainable aspects and get good returns, then why wouldn't it be appealing to every area? We've just seen that it has been more, I suppose, in various areas. You know, the asset owners have been bigger on it, but it's been the asset owners that have been focused on these long-term views, say around climate change or around equality, and they've got that end focus of their members in mind. So I think it's getting back to the member, and then I suppose doing, you know, market appraisals. You are certainly seeing from a more commercial perspective, you know, millennials are very interested in this area. Females often have a higher uptake of interest in investing in sustainable type funds, high net worth as well. So, you know, I focus on, you know, who you're investing on behalf of, and then look at more commercial opportunities and aspects, I suppose, in market segments.
Thank you. Alistair, do you have any tips?
I wouldn't a good question from the anonymous questioner. I wouldn't differentiate hugely between the boardroom and the man and woman in the street. Speaking a language that they understand, be sensitive to their other pressures that they're facing, and present this as a solution, not as a problem. They're human beings as well, even though they sit around a boardroom table. And if you remember those 3 things, they will come to the conclusion themselves that this is an area for priorities. So don't differentiate the boardroom from the man and woman in the street.
I imagine you'd be very convincing, Alistair. So thanks for that. Alexia, do you have any tips?
Well, I'm fortunate enough now to be working for a business where it's 100% sustainability and core to the DNA. I did spend about 12 years at a wealth manager where the spectrum of support, belief, understanding was definitely mixed, and I had many in the business who were hugely supportive of sustainability, and they tended to be the ones who had the clients that were asking the right questions. So I think it's very basic and based on demonstrating, as Bill said, the demand for it that's out there, and that generally gets a boardroom more enthusiastic in it if it's a new angle to develop.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you. Mike, do you have any experiences or tips that you can share for people working within fund managers?
Yeah. So a couple of things. So the first one is trying to lead by example, and that is to deliver competitive investment returns by investing sustainably. And that has led to the funds within the Sustainable Future range growing largely. And I think management can't ignore the success story of the Sustainable Future funds. You've got so that's the first thing, is to in some ways show the business case for why this is a great thing. But what often gets forgotten about with this is that we strongly believe that not looking at investment trends and understanding the big trends that are going to affect our economy over the next 10, 20, 30 years, and not understanding what the material things that that business you're invested in should be managing well. Without knowing that, you are making a suboptimal investment decision. You're ignoring a whole load of information, and you're just looking at the other two traditional bits. So I would say, don't forget, this stuff affects investment returns. If you are running a lot of money and those people running the money have never really seriously thought about climate change and how they're positioned, I would say that that is a massive risk. And it's something that needs to be addressed to drive that, to understand these, something that the market is gradually becoming more and more aware of. So it's not just hey, it'd be really nice to have a cuddly sustainable fund and we can do nice pictures and everything. It's about, if you're an investor and you're investing other people's money, you need to know about this stuff and you need to be implementing it in your portfolios. That would be my view.
Thank you so much. Powerful. I'm going to give the last word to Mandy. How do you think your style of research can help push the investment industry? Do you think that has a bit of a role to play?
Yeah, I think from my perspective, the tone at the top is always really important. So as much as you can sort of push those at the top of your companies and industries to eat, breathe, and speak ESG, I think that's important. So, it does seem to set the tone for the firm and create a culture around ESG within the firm.
All right. Okay. I think we're going to have to wrap it up there, but thank you all so much. That was such a great conversation. I really enjoyed it. And it's just so great speaking to people that are as passionate about this topic as I am and the rest of the team at UCSIF. So thank you, Bill, Mike, Alexia, Alistair, and Mandy. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for having us on. Thanks.
Thank you.